Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A few technical challenges to make things interesting. Also, a few weather challenges for all of you to overcome, and we appreciate your being here on such a day as this. And tomorrow is going to be even more fun. And if I appear a bit scattered today and I'm unable to find my words, it's because I'm thinking ahead to the symposium tomorrow at the Library of Virginia. For those of you who have not planned to attend yet, and we know some people have come from Luray, Virginia today to be with us tomorrow. Thank you. The Person of the Year Symposium, our annual symposium at the Library of Virginia from 9:30 to, actually, we'll finish up before 4, we hope, tomorrow to give people a chance to get on the road. It is still possible to attend, although at this point you cannot order your lunch. But it's an all-day symposium featuring 5 very good speakers who will be nominating candidates for the Person of the Year of 1865, who most influenced or personified and exemplified events for that year. And at the end of the day, you have a chance to vote on who the Person of the Year was. It's very clearly modeled on the Time magazine Person of the Year, where it measures not character or popularity, but importance. And it's great fun. It's the last of a series of 5 that we have done. And let's hope for good weather, because the Library of Virginia is ultimately, where it's held, is ultimately in charge of deciding whether they close or not. So knock wood that all the preps will not have been in vain and that we'll have our symposium tomorrow as planned. Now, I couldn't have asked for a better introduction than what the Richmond Times-Dispatch gave me this morning in this paper. Those of you who read the column, 150 years ago, sesquicentennial column. Today's on Negro soldiers, on the very topic of my program today. So thank you, Catherine Kalos and the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And I know that I talk sources a lot when I give my programs, one of my hallmarks. So let me just, right up front, tell you to recommend some reading for you, because this program is just really a tip of the iceberg of this topic of the debate over arming the slaves in 1864 and 1865. The book by Robert Durden is mostly a source book, published in 1972. Just more of the same of what I'm going to be giving you today, but a greater sample of the debate and from all quarters, as I'll be describing shortly. And then Bruce Levine's 2006 book is an interpretation of the debate and the wider debate over arming the slaves. But if your appetite is whetted, or you want to get the better sense that what I'm telling you is actually representative of the whole, then these books will answer your questions for you. And I'm going to start, as we should, 150 years ago, not today, we'll get to that soon enough, of what happened 150 years ago today, but 150 years ago earlier in the month. On February 9th, in fact, 1865, just down the street, about a block and a half from here, the former location of the first African church, what is now the African Baptist Church at College Street, between Marshall and Broad. One of the largest public spaces in all of Richmond, which was why so many big public events were held there during the war. And it was a particularly appropriate place for the mass meetings, plural, that occurred over a series of days in February of 1865. The immediate background for this, just a few days earlier, the long-awaited peace conference at Hampton Roads, the one that you learn about in the Lincoln movie, had been held. A lot of hopes north and south, particularly south, in the war-weary South, and things were not looking good. They had gone south in early 1865. A lot of people had great hopes for this peace conference, but it came to naught when within minutes the high-level delegation, including Abraham Lincoln and Alexander Stephens on the other side, came to loggerheads. The Confederacy wanted independence. The North wanted reconstruction of the old Union. Nothing more to talk about. It was a difficult time in the South in particular, a lot of disappointment with the failure of this peace conference, and morale was sinking in the South. Desertion was a problem. So these mass meetings were held in the face of the failure of the peace conference, in the wake of this declining morale, to try to boost morale and to convince Southerners to fight on for independence, what the cost of subjugation would be. Despite the failure of the peace conference, we must endure yet more to win our independence, and do anything to win our independence, including a measure that had seemed so radical as to not even be on the table several years before. That is, to arm the slaves to fight for the Confederacy. And among the speakers that day was Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, who addressed the crowd, a long speech published in the Richmond Daily Dispatch then, but one excerpt for it. Let us say to every Negro who wishes to go into the ranks on condition of being made free, go and fight, you are free. We know that everyone who could fight for his freedom has had no chance. The only side that has had the advantage of this element is the Yankee, a people that can beat us to the end of the year in making bargains. Let us imitate them in this. My own Negroes have been to me and said, Master, set us free, and we will fight for you. We had rather fight for you than for the Yankees. But I suppose it should not be so. There is no harm in trying. With all my early attachments and prejudices, I would give it all up if it can be done by the states separately. What state will lead off in this thing? And then a voice cried out, Virginia. That was clearly one of the purposes of this mass meeting, was to rally public opinion in favor of taking the step of arming the slaves. And as you know, Virginia, in fact, did carry through and ultimately led the movement for passing an act that passed in March of 1865 to embark upon an experiment to arm as many as 300,000 black troops to fight for the Confederacy. But we'll get to that stage in a few minutes. You're all familiar, if you are loyal attendees of this brown bag program, one of the best programs we've had, I think, by Michael Thomas last year in a biographical talk about this man, Patrick Cleburne, General Patrick Cleburne. And it was held last year because that was the anniversary of when he proposed to his generals in Georgia a proposal to arm the slaves in January of 1865, circulated a memorandum to his generals and then discussed it. And in his memorandum, he made a couple of points. Cleburne, being an Irishman, a foreigner, not as invested in slavery as many other people were, believed that if push came to shove, the Confederacy certainly would choose independence over slavery. We would give lie to this argument made all over in the North and throughout the world that the Confederacy cared more about slavery than it did about its independence. He acknowledged that slavery had proven to be, and it would prove yet again in the ensuing year, a terrible barrier for the Confederacy to diplomatic recognition. They kept coming up over and over among the British and the French. As long as you have slavery, recognition is basically not possible. So to win diplomatic recognition, we must give it up. To have more manpower available, we must give it up. The Yankees are doing it, we must do it. Same arguments that Benjamin was making. And of course, you know the result of that. The proposal was squelched. Some people wanted Cleburne's head on a platter. He never received another promotion. He was considered disloyal for making that. Jefferson Davis himself received word through a back channel and said, basically, we want to destroy all evidence this proposal was ever made, hear nothing more of it. And in fact, if not for the survival of a copy in a staff officer's papers, many years later it came to light, and only then it was so well squelched. So in January of '64, the Confederacy was not ready for this yet, despite the good sense that Cleburne made in his arguments. A little later in the war, this man, nobody's ever seen him before, Henry Watkins Allen, governor of Louisiana, also a general in Confederate forces, wrote a letter to Secretary of War James Seddon in September of 1864, a letter that was intercepted by the Yankees and published in northern newspapers. The time has come for us to put into the Army every able-bodied Negro man as a soldier. They will make much better soldiers with us than against us, and swell the now depleted ranks of our armies. That what became public letter by Governor Allen in fall of 1864 ignited a debate. We'll have several references to this now obscure letter that was published in newspapers and became public in September of 1864. Somebody who's not so obscure, particularly in these parts, Jefferson Davis, came around to this viewpoint himself in November of 1864 in his annual address to Congress. The same man who had squelched absolutely Cleburne's memorial, his proposal in January of 1864, in his annual message pushed the envelope and suggested what he called a radical modification of the way the Confederacy impresses black laborers, to change the relationship he had all kinds of barriers to work with, states' rights as well as the reluctance of slave owners to give up their slaves, as well as the reluctance of Southerners to have thousands of armed black men fighting on their behalf. But he suggested emancipation. He suggested that the Confederate government acquire completely, not just impress, that is draft, but acquire completely up to 40,000 African Americans for service with the Army as teamsters or cooks or laborers or hospital workers, etc. He proposed acquiring them and emancipating them. Referring no doubt to Governor Allen's now public statement, he said, "I must dissent from those who advise a general levy and arming of the slaves for the duty of soldiers." In other words, it's all right for teamsters, cooks, laborers, hospital workers, etc., but he dissents from making them soldiers. Keep that distinction in mind for later. "Until our white population shall prove insufficient for the armies we require," quote unquote, Davis preferred to use only white soldiers for now. But, quote, "should the alternative ever be presented of subjugation or of the employment of the slave as a soldier, there seems to be no reason to doubt what should then be our decision." In other words, we're not there yet, but if push comes to shove, I have no fundamental objection to using them as soldiers. We're not there yet. I'm not saying that we need to do it now, but he was setting up a trial balloon, in other words. And the debate was underway when the president of the Confederacy suggests, maybe just possibly, that we emancipate slaves and allow them to fight for us if our white population can't do the job themselves. You can imagine the debate that ignited. Now, what a lot of people had in mind, of course, was what had already been done in the North. And of course, the South was lampooning what had been done in the North. This cartoon of Abraham Lincoln offering the newly emancipated African Americans the chance to fight. One good turn deserves another. Now that we've issued the Emancipation Proclamation, do you want to join our ranks? And the Confederacy made fun of that. But of course, when the U.S. colored troops swelled upwards of 200,000 men, proved to be a difference maker in the war, and effective fighters, though they were used only sparingly in actual battle, but they, of course, then spared more white men to fight. The Confederacy could see the handwriting on the wall, and it could see that they did indeed make good soldiers for the other side. So why shouldn't we be doing the same? And of course, when the public debate started in the South, turnabout is fair play. If the Southern cartoonists can have fun, so can the Northern cartoonists. So here's the impetuous charge of the 1st Colored Regiment, Confederate Colored Regiment. Here's the blue soldier. "Come in, boys, dinner's ready. We's a free." In other words, that to put African-American troops into the Southern Army would have the effect of basically giving them over to the Northern Army, was the expectation of Northern cartoonists as well as much of the Northern public. They were skeptical of the South's ability to carry this off and what would happen if they did. Keep this cartoon in mind again, you'll see it again. In January of 1865, a very important voice weighed in on this whole debate. Robert E. Lee wrote a letter on January 11th, 1865 to State Senator Andrew Hunter, and he wrote several other letters that were made public in February of 1865. The January letter to Hunter was never published until after the war, but it became common knowledge among the elite in the Army and in the Confederate government. It was much discussed that Lee had come out for arming the slaves. And we have a copy, a true copy, not in his hand, of that letter to Humphreys, and to Hunter rather. As many of you know, I like to rely as much as possible on our own documents and our own collections when I give these talks. I'm going to do so again today. So this is the first of several letters in our own collection. It's a 5-page handwritten letter. I'm not going to read it all to you or make you read it yourself. But here's a couple of the points. He's weighing in on the solution of a question in which I feel an interest commensurate with my desire for the welfare and happiness of our people. Speaking about slavery, considering the relation of master and slave controlled by humane laws and influenced by Christianity and enlightened public sentiment as the best that can exist between the white and black races, while intermingled as at present in this country, I would deprecate sudden disturbance of that relation unless it be necessary to avert a greater calamity to both. I should therefore prefer to rely upon our white population, as had Davis, to preserve the ratio between our forces and those of the enemy, which experience has shown to be safe. But in view of the preparation of our enemies, it is our duty to prepare for, and he goes on to say, basically, it's not a perfect world. We don't have those forces. I think, therefore, we must decide whether slavery shall be extinguished by our enemies and the slaves be used against us, or use them ourselves at the risk of the effects which may be produced upon our social institution. My own opinion is that we should employ them without delay. Patrick Cleburne, as you know, had died at Franklin on November 30th, 1864. If he had lived a few more months, he would have had the pleasure of seeing Robert Lee state more or less what he had in a year earlier, in January 1864, in very much the same terms. And he goes on to this, but it is certain that the best foundation upon which the fidelity of an army can rest, especially in a service which imposes peculiar hardships and privations, is basically they have to be invested in the cause in some way. And what could make our slaves be invested in our cause? By giving immediate freedom to all who enlist, and freedom at the end of the war to those who discharge their duties faithfully, whether they survive or not, together with the privilege of residing at the South. To this might be added a bounty for faithful service. And it says once again, it must be done immediately, without delay. So saith Robert E. Lee in January of 1865. And his word was very influential in the evolving debate. When it became public in the North, once again, the cartoonist had a good time. Lee handing a rifle to Sambo. Prospects of the Southern Sambo. Lee, hold on there, driver. We want Sambo now to fight for liberty and independence. You can thrash him as much as you like when he comes back. Which is, of course, what some people feared, which is why Lee was so adamant that we have to give them something substantial, their freedom, as part of this. The Negro Bill was introduced, as it was called, was introduced into Congress in February of 1865. The debate that I'm going to be talking about began in the months before that. But the Negro Soldier Bill, introduced in February 5th and 7th, I think, of 1865, and put on the fast track for discussion. This is one of the amendments in our imprint collection. So let's go through the debate using sources in our own collection. This one might not be as, I meant to crop it a little more for you, but I give you just a sampling of the arguments made on both sides. And as you'll see in any debate, if you look at the primary sources, you'll see the entire spectrum of opinion. And you'll see that people were all over the map. And so it's hard to make generalizations except that there was a divided opinion. So this resolution came from the legislature of the state of North Carolina. And I'll have to read it for you if I can read it. That the state of North Carolina protests against the arming of slaves by the Confederate government in any emergency that could possibly arise. Continued to protest on principle, and particularly on states' rights principle, that it must be done with the authority of state authorities and not by the Confederate government. So to some degree, this diet of states' rights school about the defeat of the Confederacy is manifested here. But also just a skepticism, once again, that the time had come for anything so radical. The men of the Army were enlisted to weigh in. If you think spin control is something new with Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, think again. The name may be new, but spin control existed back then. The Confederate public, the Southern public, knew that the opinion of the soldiers would weigh mightily in this debate. Would they want African-American soldiers in their ranks with them? Would they fight? Would they desert? Would they welcome them or not? So the soldiers were enlisted, in another sense, to weigh in. They were encouraged to pass resolutions, which were then sent into the newspapers like the Richmond Sentinel and the Richmond Inquirer, from which I've drawn these examples from our collections, with all kinds of opinions, mostly going back to that February 9th meeting, that mass meeting, to stand up and say, despite the failure of the peace conference, despite the odds against us, we're still in it for the long run. We want our independence above all, and we'll sacrifice, we'll bear every burden, pay every cost. And that's what a lot of the resolutions passed by soldiers were, but for many of them, they also passed resolutions specifically weighing in on the question of arming the slaves. So the 1st Virginia Regiment, raised largely from this area, resolved that though disaster and gloom now hover over us, we believe all things will be so ordered in the coming campaign that our wrongs will be avenged, our rights secured, and those who now claim us slaves will own us as victors, and resolve that we would hail with acclamation the enrollment into our armies of Negro troops. We therefore recommend to our representatives in Congress assembled to use their endeavors for the immediate accomplishment of this end. What this did for the public morale was great. The soldiers, the boys in the rank, the ones who were bearing the cost the most, are behind this proposal. The 18th Battalion Virginia Artillery, Griffin's battalion, passed resolutions. Some of them I have just because they're so much fun. Lee had just been made commander-in-chief, or commanding general, don't tell Lee. Davis, he was commander-in-chief of the Army, and they were commending the Congress for that. That we have unlimited confidence in the wisdom and patriotism of our representatives in Congress. When was the last time you heard that? And the Virginia legislature, and earnestly solicit them, if in their judgment the crisis demands it, to tender to our beloved president, you don't hear that very often either, the slaves of Virginia, to aid in driving from her soil the nefarious invader who now pollutes it. They don't write resolutions like they used to. The Mississippi soldiers, Joseph Davis's brigade, Joseph Davis being the nephew of Jefferson Davis, commander of the Mississippi brigade that reached one of the ones that reached the high tide at Gettysburg. They passed resolutions including that we are in favor of the introduction of the Negro as a soldier into the military service of the Confederacy upon such conditions as Congress and the wisdom of our rulers may seem fit to determine. The famous Texas Brigade, formerly John Bell Hood's Texas Brigades, resolved that the great peril of the country and the extreme emergency should prompt all friends of the cause to lay aside all prejudice and accept the necessity of arming such a portion of our Negro population as may be deemed necessary by our able commander-in-chief. And also then scores how the Yankees have been using Negro troops. We know them better, they will fight better for us, we will do better by them than the Union Army has done as part of their resolutions. And Harris's brigade of Mississippians also in the Army of Northern Virginia. There were dozens of these resolutions passed, dozens of sets of resolutions passed and published in Richmond papers in this spin control, this propaganda campaign that was part of this debate in the winter of 1865. Resolved that it is the duty of Congress, and we earnestly request our senators and representatives to place at the disposal of the executive all the resources of the country, including gold, cotton, and tobacco, and as many Negroes as our commander-in-chief may deem wise and proper to be employed as laborers and as soldiers, making that distinction between laborers, which had been done, of course, throughout the war, and as soldiers. Once again, deferring to the judgment, the question obviously of timing, as it was for Lee, as it was for Davis, approving in principle, and is it yet necessary? Many people were coming around to the belief in early 65 that the time had come. That did not, however, include the ranks of the 3rd Virginia Cavalry, whose resolution was very different. That on the subject of recruiting our armies, it is our deliberate opinion that the wisdom in legislation and firmness in the execution of the laws would speedily raise a sufficient force of white troops to guarantee our independence, that we contemplate with anxiety and apprehension the proposition to enlist Negro troops in our armies, seriously doubting both its expediency and practicability, dreading its effects upon our social system, and earnestly desiring to see the independence of our country established by the strong arms of her white people, who have bravely resisted her enemies thus far. So some units did not believe that the time had come to enlist black troops in this effort, and they were not few in number. So the propaganda campaign sometimes backfired, because a lot of these men did not. Okay. Oh yes, that actually is a slide. Written on the back of a brown paper bag, it looks like. Ironically, this man, Charlie Bowman's family had a stationery company in Richmond. So don't buy paper from them. It doesn't age well. But what it says is, in the trenches, October 1864. Charlie Bowman wrote to his parents in the wake of the debate that began even before Davis's message, when Governor Allen's letter hit the streets. What Charlie Bowman, seen here in a post-war photograph of the Odie Battery, Richmond's Odie Battery, I'll quote his letter. In regard to arming the Negroes, I must differ with you. I never want to see one with a gun in his hand. I am perfectly willing that they should be put into the Army as wagon drivers, cooks, engineers, etc. But I never want to fight side by side with one. The Army would not submit to it. Half, if not more than half, would lay down their guns if forced to fight with Negroes. I have heard a great many soldiers express their opinion on the subject, but have not heard a single one who said he was in favor of it. In fact, they were nearly unanimous in saying that they would rather desert than serve with him. I think that is the worst measure that could be proposed, and hope that it will not be brought before Congress at all, but it is, I hope and trust, that its rejection will be unanimous. But if Congress does pass such a bill, they will sound the death knell of the Confederacy. As for the fighting, I think that one white soldier is worth a regiment of black. I have seen some black people come out to the trenches, and that they are so afraid of being shot that they almost crawl on their hands and knees. I hope the papers will say no more about the subject, for in my humble opinion, it will only create dissatisfaction among our troops. This is a private letter sent to dear father, not to be published in the paper. That's what you see mostly in private letters. Keep in mind, this is October, before the things got even more desperate. The desertion problem, the manpower crisis for the Confederacy became all the more desperate before Davis, before Lee had weighed in favor. So those are the variables for this demonstrative no vote for Charlie Bowman. But we see in other letters, such as this one, all we know is that your friend wrote from Kiki, Louisiana, to dear Judd, we don't know who it was, but on February 4th, 1865, manuscript in our collection. Is it possible that our government will be mad enough to arm the slaves? It would be the death blow to our cause. For every 100 we would put in the field, we would arm, equip, and drill 99 soldiers for the enemy. And it goes on to say that and if we did, they would, if we offered them social and political equality as the incentive for fighting for us, they would not believe us, while the Yankees would offer both and be believed. They will mutiny and deliver up every post in which they form even a part of the garrison, and in the day of battle turn against us in the field. A more puerile idea than that of relying on them was never broached, though it be sustained by the President, General Lee, and Governor Allen. This guy didn't care that these people had weighed in its favor. And that's to say, that's what you see in almost all the manuscripts in which soldiers were involved in this debate. You remember this cartoon? Isn't that essentially what this fellow is saying from Kiki, Louisiana? If we enlist 100, we'll be giving 99 to the enemy. That was the strong opinion among the soldiers as well. But nonetheless, Congress did pass the act approved March 13th, 1865, an act innocently entitled an act to increase the military forces of the Confederate States. By the way, it passed the House of Representatives on February 20th, 1865, 150 years ago today. And it passed by the vote of 40 to 37. It passed the Senate on my birthday, March 4th, 9 to 8. After Alan Caperton and Robert M.T. Hunter of Virginia were instructed by the Virginia General Assembly, we don't care what you think, they were against it. Vote for it. Otherwise, it would have been the other way, and the bill would have been voted down. But it passed. And you can maybe read by now some of the terms of it. The critical, a couple of things about it that are interesting. One is the possibility of, obviously up here, in order to repel invasion, maintain the rightful possession of the Confederate States, secure their independence, and preserve their institutions. That's interesting, because isn't freeing the slaves and arming the slaves destroying the most important of those institutions? When you read the institutions in any document from the antebellum and wartime South, it usually means slavery. So preserving their institutions by destroying it, like in the Vietnam era, we destroy this town to save it. Or did they mean perhaps that they were trying to preserve this institution by enlisting slaves? Come back to that later. But notice how this thing works. If one thing is they're going to organize them in units as high as battalions, companies, where is that? Brigades, is that in there? Up to 300,000. But it's hedged in such a way that it's not done without the permission of the states and the permission of the slave owners. It has to be voluntary. And that obviously was necessary to get it done because of all the objections from people in Congress and in the public at large that this would destroy slavery. There's a lot of reservations about this, even in March 1865, a few weeks before Appomattox. They didn't know Appomattox was 3 weeks in the future, of course. But importantly here, that nothing in this act shall be construed to authorize a change in the relation which the said slaves shall bear toward their owners, except by consent of the owners and of the states in which they may reside, in the pursuance and the laws thereof. So much for emancipation as a precondition for arming the slaves, as Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis had been counseling. Now, in this, no, don't expect you to read this. This is the implementation of it by General Orders number 14 by Sam Cooper's office, the Adjutant General's office, that includes this clause. The enlistment of colored persons under this act will be made upon printed blah, blah, blah. There will be, no slave will be accepted as a recruit unless with his own consent and with the approbation of his master by a written instrument, conferring as far as he may the rights of a freedman, in which will be filed with the superintendent. So you have to have, like getting your teacher's permission to skip class. You have to have the permission of your slave owner. You can imagine that this would probably hold down the number of slaves that were actually going to be enlisted in the Confederate armies because they required all these barriers, all these hurdles that they had to jump over, and a few other terms that I won't go into. But nonetheless, some troops were raised in those weeks between March 1865 and April in Appomattox. There were companies of Negroes that were recruited primarily from the hospitals, Winder and Stewart Hospital out by Maymont Bird Parkway. They had been drilled even in Capitol Square. They had been raised and they were being prepared for service. And there's evidence that some of them were serving, in fact, on the road to Appomattox. So the wheels were turning. One of the great what-ifs, of course, in Confederate history is, what if this had been done earlier? How many troops could have been raised? As it turns out, only a few companies were raised, despite a rumor we'll read about in just a moment of tens of thousands of them. But if it had been done earlier, especially maybe in January of 1864, as Pat Cleburne had counseled, what would have happened? Well, clearly, if you required the slave owner's permission and the state's permissions, a lot of people were reluctant to give up their slaves. It probably would not have resulted in the numbers they were hoping for. This is another letter in our collection by a fellow who belonged to the local defense troops, John Pilcher from Richmond. He was in service, and while our regiment was out, a company of Negro troops was in camp near us. They were organized at Camp Winder and commanded by hospital stewards from that place. Along Alonzo Buck was an orderly sergeant. Hold on, is that it? Yeah. An orderly sergeant. Okay, let's skip that. I hope we will be able to accomplish something by the use of Negro soldiers, but I'm very sure that slavery has received its death blow. A paper reports that General Kirby Smith out in the Trans-Mississippi has 25,000 Negro troops under his command. He had hardly 40,000 on paper and fewer than 25,000 total under his command, so that was surely a matter of the rumor mill. And one other soldier, Johnny Speer of Georgia, wrote on April 2nd, 1865, echoing what Pilcher said, "One thing is certain, slavery is doomed beyond doubt, whether we succeed with the black troops experiment or not. If we succeed, we are obliged to give it up. If not, it goes by the boards immediately." So one thing was clear to everyone is that slavery was doomed. Let me conclude with this man and some observations. This man, of course, is Marlborough Jones. Many of you know him well. He's an amber type in our collection that has been widely used since we acquired it in the late 80s rather, in the early 90s. He was a camp servant. It's a wonderful photograph, dressed in a Confederate uniform. He was a camp servant for a Georgia cavalryman who was killed at the Battle of Trevilian Station, accompanied his body back home to Georgia, and then came back, reportedly. but he was a camp servant. He was never an enlisted man. But there's been a lot of talk, of course, in the last few decades about black Confederates and about men like Marlborough, whom we know to have been in the ranks of the Confederate Army by the tens of thousands, that is, serving with the Army, no doubt about it, as laborers, as camp servants, as musicians, as cooks. It was an integrated army. So the debate now, of course, is who was he and what did he do? Was he a soldier in any definition of the word? And we debate it, and it's to some degree an honest debate. To some degree, it's propaganda. To some degree, it's ideologically driven by those who want to create an African-American Confederate history to help blunt modern African-Americans' criticisms of the Confederacy. So we read about these hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of fighting forces in the Confederacy, not just men serving with the Army, but serving as soldiers in some capacity in the Army. And that even made it into a Virginia textbook a couple of years ago and sparked a controversy. But regardless of all that propaganda and some blatant untruths, it's in our interest to know more about these men who served and what they did. And some good work is being done now. Irvin Jordan's landmark 1995 book is the starting point for a lot of this. And there's a lot of work done by some colleagues and former colleagues of mine about men who might have passed as white and passed and served in the Army, or men who were even known in their neighborhoods to be colored, light-skinned, colored, and were allowed to serve anyway because they were considered good Southern men. And we know that there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of formerly enlisted African-American cooks and musicians. But the question comes down once again, were they soldiers? And we have a huge debate going on now about what that means. To me, this is where I'm heading toward here. This debate that occurred in 1864, 1865 answers these questions for us. Think again about some of these things I was reading you. Jefferson Davis, Judah Benjamin, and everybody else making the distinction between whether or not we'll let them serve as servants, as laborers, as digging trenches and fortifications, as wagon masters, as teamsters. That's all right. But do we want them to serve as soldiers? That's another question. They made, in other words, a very functional distinction between those two. They defined soldiers as a man who was formally enlisted and had a gun in his hand, and not just firing a shot in anger, as many African Americans traveling with the Army no doubt did. They understood that distinction to be the people who were teamsters were not soldiers as they. It's not our judgment looking back, it's their judgment. They made a clear distinction in this debate. I don't have any problem with them being wagon drivers, but soldiers, that's another matter. And that was true. Civilians, soldiers, newspaper editors, all the people who were involved in this most intensive and extensive public debate during the entire life of the Confederacy. Thank you.